The water tears the wing wall off the low sill structure at 4 in the morning on April 12, 1973, and for a few hours no one knows whether the river has just ended the United States. 67 feet of reinforced concrete, designed to outlast everything on the Louisiana floodplain, and the river removes it like a hinge. Beneath the wall, the water has scoured a hole 300 feet wide and 60 feet deep, exposing 50 feet of steel pilings that vibrate under 2 million cubic feet of water per second. The engineers are on the phone, and none of them can say what happens next. The Mississippi did not change course that night. Emergency crews dumped rock and cement grout around the clock and held the line, but here's what the world learned in that flood. The Mississippi runs where it runs because America built a machine to make it stay there, and the machine almost lost. Most people believe the Mississippi is where it is because that is where it belongs. It is the longest navigable river on Earth, and it has flowed past New Orleans for so long that the city treats it as a fact of nature. The maps are lying. Rivers move. The Mississippi has abandoned its own channels again and again over the last few thousand years, each time finding a shorter, steeper path to the Gulf, and leaving the old channel to silt up and die. Right now, waiting just upstream of Baton Rouge, there is a route the river wants more than any other: the Atchafalaya. It is roughly 150 miles shorter and 20 feet lower than the current course, and water, given the choice, always takes the shortest drop. The river is not in its channel by nature, it is in its channel by force, held there by a single complex of concrete and steel built 60 years ago, and the entire American economy downstream is standing on top of that concrete. This is the core fact of American geography, and almost no one has told it. The Mississippi is a hostage. It wants to leave, and it has wanted to leave for a century. Every year the Atchafalaya route gets a little deeper, because every year the river pushes a little more water and sediment down it, and every year the main channel grows a little more fragile. The capture is not a theory, it is a process. It was already 1/3 complete in 1950, when the federal government realized that if nothing was done, the Mississippi would leave New Orleans behind within a generation, and so Congress did the only thing a government can do with a river that has made up its mind: it built a wall in its way. But before the wall, there was the flood. To understand why America froze a river in place, go back to 1927, to the spring when the Mississippi decided to take the whole country with it. The rains came in April, heavier than anyone had ever measured, and the river, squeezed for decades between ever higher levees, blew through its defenses in 145 places. It covered 27,000 square miles across 7 states. 500,000 people lost everything, most of them poor black sharecroppers left to drown on the rooftops. In New Orleans, the men in charge made the most brutal decision in American flood history. They dynamited a levee south of the city, on purpose, to let the river drown Plaquemines Parish instead. The city survived. The parish did not, and when the water went down, the government understood what it had refused to admit for 100 years. The levees had made the flood worse. Containment was not working. Command was the only option left. The command was built between 1955 and 1963 at a place called Old River, where the Mississippi and the Red River meet the head of the Atchafalaya. The Old River control structure is not a dam. It is a gate, floodgates, a low sill, an overbank structure, and a navigation lock, designed to do one thing: hold the river at the exact shape it had in 1950, when roughly 30% of the combined flow was already running down the Atchafalaya. The structure cost $67 million, and its operating rule is almost insultingly simple. 70% of the water stays in the Mississippi. 30% goes down the Atchafalaya. No more, no less, forever. The Corps of Engineers built the machine, and then they did something no one had ever done to a river before. They stopped time. The river became a fixed asset, like a highway or a power plant, and for 9 years that is what it was. Quiet, static, permanent. The most successful act of geography holding in human history, and it lasted exactly as long as the river allowed it to. The water keeps coming after the wall falls, and that is the part that breaks the engineers. On April 12, 1973, the low sill structure loses its south wing wall, and then the river begins eating the foundation itself, carving a hole beneath the concrete. The structure was designed to hold a 37-foot difference in water level between the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya. The spring of 1973 pushes it past the edge, and for days the men working the flood fight live in a specific terror. If the whole structure goes, the Mississippi will dump itself down the Atchafalaya in a single season, and the river at Baton Rouge and New Orleans will become a memory. The emergency response is not elegant. It is rock and cement grout, pumped into the void around the clock until the water slows. The structure holds. Barely. And when the flood drops, the engineers deliver the verdict that haunts the project to this day: the low sill structure is permanently damaged. Not degraded, not aging, permanently damaged by one flood in one spring. The river has wounded the machine built to wound it, and the wound is not healing. Everything built after 1973 is a response to that wound, and you can read the history of American anxiety in the construction schedule. First the repair, 8 years of rehabilitation, grouting, re-engineering the gates. Then the backup, a new auxiliary structure, authorized at roughly $200 million, opened in 1986, whose entire job is to take pressure off the wounded original. Then the hydroelectric station, finished in 1990, which converts the river's anger into electricity, as if the government can charge the hostage for its own captivity. And over all of it hangs the new rule. The structure designed for a 37-foot difference in water level is now only allowed 22. The river is stronger than the machine, and everyone knows it. Downstream, at the Morganza spillway, the relief valve of the entire system, 125 gates, opened exactly twice in 60 years, once in 1973, when the main structure was dying, and once in 2011, when the river threatened it again. And the river has not stopped trying. In 2011, the flood that opened Morganza for the second time in history came within feet of forcing the old river structures to their limit. In 2018 and again in 2023, the forecasts were bad enough that the whole flood fight apparatus stood up early, barges stacked with rock, dredges on standby, because the river was, once again, considering its options. None of those years broke the structure. That is not the same as the river giving up. The river has 100,000 years of practice and a steeper path to the Gulf, and every flood season it moves a little more sediment down the Atchafalaya, making its own victory a little more certain. The men who manage the river know this, which is why the flood fight manual never says the crisis is over. It says the crisis is managed. There is a difference, and the difference is the entire history of the old river control structure. To understand why a wounded concrete machine on a Louisiana back channel matters to the rest of the world, understand what rides on the river's obedience. The number that explains it best is 60%. 60% of every grain export in the United States moves on the Mississippi system. Corn and soybeans and wheat from Iowa and Illinois and Minnesota barge south to the ports of Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and South Louisiana, the largest port complex on Earth, and loaded onto ships that feed a large part of the planet. The river is the conveyor belt of American agriculture, and the conveyor belt is held in place by one gate system with a damaged foundation. The engineers who saved it in 1973 did not celebrate when the water dropped. They built a second structure to protect the first, then a power plant, and then they went to bed every night for the next 50 years knowing the river was still there, still waiting, still measuring the wall. One morning, after a flood that nobody predicted, the Mississippi stops obeying the old river control structure, and the first thing that dies is a city that does not drown. New Orleans does not go underwater when the river leaves. That is the twist. The levee system fails downward, and what fills the lower river is salt. The Gulf of Mexico, which has waited 10,000 years behind the river's fresh water, pushes upstream past the empty ports, past the refineries, past the intake pipes that drink the water of 1 million people, and the city that has fought floods for 3 centuries finds itself fighting the opposite problem. Its drinking water is poison, its shipping channel is a dead end, its reason for existing is somewhere else, running down a shorter road to the sea. The water does not destroy New Orleans, it retires it the way a company retires a machine that can no longer do the job. And the machine's replacement, the new channel down the Atchafalaya, drowns Morgan City instead and builds a new delta where farmland used to be, and in a few years people will say the river always meant to go there, which is true. And they will say it as if it were a comfort. The rest of the collapse is a supply chain, and supply chains collapse in order. The port district around New Orleans and Baton Rouge generates more than $100 billion a year in economic value for the United States, and roughly 1 in 5 jobs in Louisiana is tied to the maritime economy. The grain elevators empty and never refill because the barges that carried 60% of America's grain exports cannot float to the Gulf, and world buyers do not wait. They switch to Brazil, to Argentina, to the Black Sea, and the market share America spent a century building shifts in a single harvest season. The petrochemical corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, one of the densest industrial stretches on Earth, loses its water, its shipping, and its reason to exist. And the bridges and pipelines across the Atchafalaya Basin fail one by one as the new river scours their foundations. A 1980 federal study priced the transport damage at $200 million to $1 billion. You cannot insure against a river moving. And the strangest part of the collapse is that it is not sudden, it is geological. The scientists who studied the structure after 1973 wrote the scenario down in a 1980 report, and their language is more terrifying than any disaster movie because they treat the outcome as certain. The Atchafalaya will eventually become the principal distributary of the Mississippi, the report says. The only question is when. Next year, within a decade, in 30 or 40 years, the final outcome is simply a matter of time. That is the official finding of the United States government, published 45 years ago, and nothing has changed since except the river's patience. Every flood since has scoured a little more foundation. The Corps of Engineers has spent decades and billions of dollars buying time, and buying time is exactly what it is, because the river is not an enemy that can be defeated. It is a force that can be delayed. The avulsion cycle runs on a 1,000-year clock, and by that clock the current channel is already overdue. The structure has held for 60 years. The river has been patient for 10,000. The arithmetic is not in the concrete's favor. So what is the lesson if the river eventually wins? Geography is maintained, not guaranteed. Every great power has believed its map was permanent, and every one of them was wrong, because maps are not gifts from nature. They are maintenance projects, and they fail the moment the maintenance stops. The United States inherited the best geography on Earth, and it spent 2 centuries building the machines that keep it working. Levees, locks, floodgates, control structures, and the most important of those machines is a concrete gate on a back channel in Louisiana that holds 60% of the nation's grain exports in place. Nobody thinks about it. It does not appear on any map, which is exactly the problem, because the things that hold a superpower together are the things its citizens have forgotten exist. The river has not forgotten. It is still measuring the wall, still waiting for the spring when the machine fails and the map changes. And the most American thing about the whole story is this. On the night in 1973 when the wall came off, the men who saved the structure were not thinking about the grain or the $100 billion. They were thinking about the water, and the water was thinking about the Atchafalaya.